Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Intas Pharmaceutical Limited, I, Dr. Mithilesh Nayak, once again welcome you all to this 8th session of Practice Pulse in Hypertension. Today we are going to discuss about the renovascular hypertension. And to guide us, we are having with us our course director, Dr. J.C. Mohan sir. He is the chairman and head Department of Cardiology at Jaipur Golden Hospital, New Delhi. He is well-known faculty in the field of cardiology, and he is popularly known as Encyclopedia of Clinical Trial in the field of cardiology. So, without wasting much time, I request Dr. J.C. Mohan sir to take the proceeding further. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mithilesh. Good evening, faculty, moderators, ladies and gentlemen. Today's focus of webinar is renovascular hypertension. As you know, that for last several months, we have been discussing various facets of hypertension, and I think that this is going on for about 7 months in a row. And we have touched upon several aspects of hypertension. One of the areas which is important to every clinician is renovascular hypertension. Kidneys are the epicenter of hypertension. And so one would think that you can't get away from discussing kidneys when you are discussing hypertension. However, vessels supplying the kidney or renovascular hypertension is relatively less common. I would say relatively less common. And there are lots of myths about renovascular hypertension. There are presentations which are mentioned in books, textbooks, the so-called textbook presentations of renovascular hypertension. However, renovascular hypertension is a much bigger subject than is really discussed. And also, there is a lot more unknown about renovascular hypertension. There was a time, and I would think that was about 25 years back, when we would do a drive-through renal angiography while doing coronary angiograms through the femoral route. Luckily, that has fallen out of favor. And we would do a renal angiogram, we would find some lesion, and of course, discuss with the patient, try to fix up the renal arteries. Without realizing that you aren't really fixing up the renovascular hypertension. It isn't that simple. You're not protecting the kidneys. It's not that simple. But then, of course, the randomized trials came up, and most of the generation of cardiologists who are doing so-called drive-through renal angiography and ad hoc renal angioplasty actually backtracked. To discuss the entire gamut of renovascular hypertension, I am happy to state that we have two prominent nephrologists and we have two prominent cardiologists. It is necessary. I think it's a very fine balance. We have amongst moderators one nephrologist and one cardiologist, and of course amongst presenters one nephrologist and one cardiologist. So let me begin by requesting Dr. Sandeep Mahajan, who is professor of nephrology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, to initiate his discussion on renovascular hypertension and tell us what we have been missing so long about renovascular hypertension. Over to you, Dr. Sandeep Mahajan.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for the kind introduction. Can I share the screen now? Just a second. I think so. Yeah. No, I think so. Brief nutshell talked beautifully about the various controversies that all through have been surrounded, that all through have compounded the renovascular hypertension. Simply to put it in a straight terms, what is renovascular hypertension? It's basically a syndrome of elevated systolic or diastolic blood pressure produced by any condition that reduces the perfusion of the kidney. Well, here where the catch is, kidney is basically an excretory organ and gets 20% of the cardiac output. So by gram to the amount of cardiac output it receives, it's second only to brain. And therefore, in fact, around 90% of the blood which perfuses the kidney is for the excretory function. And for its own housekeeping, kidney would require only 10% of that blood flow. The studies have shown actually that renal hypoxia would occur once the renal artery stenosis is at least 70%. So some would say even 80%. So therefore, the conventional wisdom with which the cardiologist or the interventionalist actually had gone down dilating the renal artery, hoping that it would benefit, didn't actually benefit because that was insignificantly, hemodynamically insignificant renal artery stenosis. So that's where the catch is. The hypertension would occur only when the kidney is relatively hyperperfused, and that would occur by at least more than 70% luminal obstruction to the renal artery. Again, Dr. Mohan very rightly pointed out, it's not a very common cause of hypertension. So if you look at all hypertensives, it would contribute only to 1 to 2% of them. But it's an important cause of secondary hypertension. So around 10% of all the hypertensives who have secondary hypertension might have a renovascular hypertension. It's important also to note that if detected early, renovascular hypertension is probably one of the few treatable causes of hypertension. So you can actually cure hypertension if you are early enough into it. Another simultaneous narrative which has been going on is, are we missing renal artery stenosis? Well, the incidence and prevalence of renal artery stenosis would entirely depend upon the age group in which the screening has been done. It has been shown that if you have an elderly population, a mean age of around 77 years, the ultrasound would detect renal artery stenosis in around 7% cases. If you do autopsies of patients who are more than 50 years of age, you would have renal artery stenosis in 27%. And if you look at those persons who had hypertension before death, then the incidence would be more than 50%. And if you look at the high-risk population who have undergone coronary angiography, then the renal artery stenosis might be present in up to 20%. So if you have elderly high-risk population, then obviously the incidence and prevalence of renal artery stenosis goes up remarkably. And this is where this is often underdiagnosed. So what I would be doing in the next 20 minutes or so would be highlighting the pathophysiology of renal vascular hypertension, the various clinical presentations, how to establish a diagnosis, just a brief snapshot of what are the common causes of renovascular hypertension and their management, and finally, the current consensus and guidelines regarding this disease. Well, as I had initially said, central to onset of renovascular hypertension is renal hyperperfusion, which would occur once the stenosis is more than 70%. This relative hypoxia to the kidney would lead on to increased renin secretion, which would activate the renin-angiotensin system remarkably. It's the angiotensin 2 which is the main driver behind this renovascular hypertension. It leads on to intense vasoconstriction, aldosterone excretion, renal sodium retention, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and also various end organ damages like the heart, as well as oxidative stress and endothelial dysfunction. Here I would also like to stress that physiologically, a unilateral renal artery stenosis is different from bilateral renal artery stenosis. And this actually was discovered in the early 20th century by the seminal experiments by Goldblatt. What he did was, we had one clip, two kidney model, and two clip, two kidney model, or one clip, one kidney model. So what he showed was that if you have unilateral renal artery stenosis, it would lead on to reduced renal perfusion of the stenotic kidney, leading on to activation of the renin-angiotensin system, and hence angiotensin II dependent hypertension. This hypertension in turn would increase the renal perfusion of the second kidney, leading on to suppression of renal angiotensin system in the contralateral kidney and natriuresis from that kidney. And hence, this ischemic kidney would remain ischemic and the hypertension would remain angiotensin II dependent hypertension. So if we block the renin-angiotensin system, you would have significant reduction in blood pressure. And this is what is used in the diagnosis by lateralization in various functional diagnostic tests. The plasma renin activity of the ipsilateral kidney or the renal vein would be high. And as I said, this is what is used in the captopril and the renin measurements by the renal vein. However, the situation is different if you have bilateral renal artery stenosis or stenosis of a single functioning kidney. The normal, the increase in renin, the angiotensin II, is not countered by the contralateral kidney, which itself is defective. And this leads on to sodium and water retention, leading on to volume expansion. This volume expansion would inhibit the renin-angiotensin system. So after some time, the hypertension would be volume dependent rather than the angiotensin II dependent. And therefore, in bilateral renal artery stenosis, the blockage of renin-angiotensin system does not dramatically reduce the blood pressure, and it can significantly lower the glomerular filtration rate. And therefore, in diagnostic test, you don't have very specific lateralization. So it is important to know the pathophysiology of unilateral and bilateral renal artery stenosis, because that differentiates, because they act differently in diagnostic test as well as therapeutic management. So what are the clinical presentations of renal artery stenosis? So in your practice, when you should start suspecting a renovascular hypertension? If you have an onset of hypertension, which is either early, that is before 30 years of age, or late, that is after 60 years of age. If the patient presents with severe accelerated hypertension or persistent worsening of hypertension in previously controlled hypertension. So many times you have a patient who till a year back was adequately controlled on a single drug, and over past year, you have to add 2 or 3 new antihypertensives to control his blood pressure. These are the patients in whom you should strongly suspect renovascular hypertension. Now, since ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is more easily available, classically, as opposed to essential hypertension, you would have abnormal circadian rhythm and loss of nocturnal dip in patients who have a renovascular hypertension. All patients who have a severe or treatment-resistant hypertension, again, you should be thinking of a renovascular hypertension. These patients, unfortunately, because of angiotensin II-mediated effect, have accelerated target organ damage, have classic history of flash pulmonary edema. This is classically seen with bilateral renal artery stenosis. The patient with various atherosclerotic disease as well as inflammatory arthritis like Takayasu would have asymmetrical pulses or renal growing. Biochemically, you can have hypokalemia, which could be because of secondary hyperaldosteronism because of increased renin production. There is a syndrome called as hyponatremic hypertensive syndrome, And in spite of avid sodium retention by the renin system, angiotensin 2 by itself is a potent mediator of polydipsia or thirst. And this can lead on to increased water intake, leading on to hyponatremia. And in patients who have significant azotemia, worsening azotemia after introduction of RAS inhibitors, this is when you should start suspecting that the patient can have renovascular hypertension. So how to establish a diagnosis? Well, the gold standard is still the conventional digital subtraction angiographic. The usual cutoff which most of the centers would take is more than 75% of the luminal stenosis of the renal artery. It has certain advantages. It can give you a functional assessment by giving you the pressure gradient. It can tell you about the level of collaterals which have formed, especially in patients who have chronic renovascular hypertension or stenosis. And in case you have a blush from the kidney in the kidney, it would indicate that the renal parenchyma is still viable. So it can also give you important functional knowledge of the kidneys if you do a conventional angiography. You can also restrict the amount of dye you can use. You can actually do a conventional DSA by only around 20 ml of dye, or you can even do a carbon dioxide angiography, which is available in most of the centers now. And if you want to plan an intervention, it can be done in the same sitting. It is obviously invasive. It has procedural complications like dissection, bleeding. It can lead on to contrast-associated acute kidney injury. Believe me, if you take adequate precautions, contrast-associated acute kidney injury is often overhyped. And if you can get away with minimal isotonic contrast, still you would have very few patients who have contrast-associated AKI. We had actually just completed the ischemia CKD trial, of which I was the principal investigator in India from the nephrology side. And in patients with moderate to advanced renal failure who were subjected to contrast nephropathy was only seen in around 6%. So if you do the procedure well enough, you take adequate precautions, contrast-associated acute kidney injury is actually overhyped. In patients who have a sudden deterioration of renal function, you should think in terms of atheroembolic renal disease, which is often overlooked. The commonest screening test which we all use is a duplex ultrasonography. We use both Doppler and B mode in this. The diagnostic cutoff is more than 60% stenosis, which is usually seen by if you have a peak systolic volume of velocity of less than 200 centimeters per second. It also gives you some functional information as telling us the resistive index, which if more than 80 would indicate a severe small vessel disease and poorly amenable to revascularization. It can also tell us about the size of the kidneys and the echogenicity, again telling us to some extent whether this disease is reversible or not. It is obviously cheap, it is non-expensive, non-invasive, it's very good for osteal lesions, however it is poor for distal lesions, and it can tell us about the renal size. However, the main problem with the Doppler study is it is dependent upon the observer as well as the patient's body habituals. In very obese patients, it becomes difficult to do a good, reliable assessment of the renal artery stenosis. CT angiography again is a very good modality. It tells you about a renovascular stenosis if the stenosis is more than 75%, just like conventional angiography, and if you have more than 50% post-stenotic dilatation. Unlike Doppler, it is also good for mid and various terminal branches of the renal arteries. The problem is basically the amount of contrast you have to use for this. That is around 125 ml. Obviously, in patients who have a poor renal function, you can't subject them to CT angiography. In patients who have severe calcification of the aorta and the renal arteries, as can occur in patients who have severe atherosclerotic disease, you can't really comment upon this stenosis. Besides, it's expensive and has radiation exposure. The other important screening modality or diagnostic modality is the MR angiography with or without contrast. The diagnostic criteria are the same. It affords a very clear visualization of the arteries. It also gives you a functional information about the renal perfusion and the renal function, and is obviously free of radiation. However, it is more subjective and has inter-observer variability. It invariably overestimates the lesion. So this is what you have to keep in mind when you are reading an MR angiography. It is significant. A functional assessment about the renal artery stenosis. As I said, all stenosis are not functional or all stenosis are not hemodynamic. And then you can have captopril renography, the renin measurement, and the more recent is the bold MRI. So, coming on to all three, captopril renography actually is a good test. It's reliable information for the size and the excretory capacity of the kidney. So it gives you some functional knowledge. It tells you about the renal blood flow and filtration. It also highlights the differential role of angiotensin II on the glomerular filtration rate. But again, as I highlighted, this is more important in unilateral renal artery stenosis. And if the test is negative, it has a very high negative predictive value that you don't have a significant renal artery stenosis for a unilateral disease. So if in a unilateral disease, you have a negative captopril renography, then you have a very likelihood that this stenosis is not hemodynamically significant. So this is how it looks like. As we can see here, the left kidney is hypoperfused, and you have a much poorer uptake of the kidney, and there is a lag in the excretion of the dye from the left kidney. However, the main limitation is you don't directly visualize the renal vessels. And again, if you have bilateral kidney disease, or even if you have significant renal impairment, this test becomes unreliable. I think so. It's the voice, the noise of the fan of the computer. So we have to live with it. So then we look at the selective renin measurement. Again, this is good for lateralization. And if you have a lateralization of more than 1.5 on the effective side, then it would tell you that this is a hemodynamically significant renal artery stenosis. And you would have a favorable response in 90% patients. However, as opposed to captopril renography, it has a very poor negative predictive value, which limits its use. The measurements to verify the role of pressure kidney the main role now left for selective renal measurement is before a nephrectomy to just ensure that removing the kidney is likely to bring down the blood pressure. Bold MRI is the new upcoming modality of the block. It basically uses contrasting paramagnetic properties of oxy and deoxyhemoglobin to depict tissue oxygenation. The magnetic rate of relaxation, the R2, correlates positively with deoxyhemoglobin levels, and this is used to measure the tissue oxygenation. The images can be obtained at baseline and following furosemide. So what happens when we give furosemide is we decrease the renal oxygen consumption, and therefore you can highlight the areas which have been hypoperfused. So this is a bold MRI image of a unilateral renal artery stenosis. As we can see, the most of the normal kidney is blue, with small areas of the medulla which are red, indicating that these are the hypoxic areas of the kidney. While in a stenotic kidney, it's predominantly red, indicating that this is the area which is having significant ischemia. So what are the recommendations regarding the diagnosis of renovascular hypertension? These are the European Society of Cardiology guidelines in 2017, which says that Doppler ultrasonography should be used as a first line for screening, with CT angiography and MR angiography are recommended radiological modalities to establish a diagnosis. The digital subtraction angiography may be considered to confirm the diagnosis when clinical suspicion is high and the above tests are inconclusive. The renal scintigraphy, the plasma renin measurement, and ACE provocation or the captopril is not recommended for screening for atherosclerotic disease. So again, you can use these tests prior to an intervention, but for screening, these tests have no value. So now coming on to the common causes and their management for the renal artery stenosis. The most common cause is atherosclerosis, followed by, in younger patients, fibromuscular dysplasia and Takayasu arthritis, especially in our country. So these three would actually account for nearly around 97 or 96% of renal artery stenosis. Coarctation of aorta, middle aortic syndrome can occur in infants and young children. Aortorenal dissection, vasculitis, like polyarteritis nodosa, and AV malformations of the renal artery, including renal artery aneurysms, are other important causes or other rarer causes of renal artery stenosis. Fibromuscular dysplasia is basically a non-inflammatory, non-atherosclerotic arteriopathy, which is characterized by arterial smooth muscle cell proliferation and fibrosis. The prevalence of clinically apparent renovascular fibromuscular dysplasia is estimated to be around 4 in 1,000. However, once we do renal angiography for healthy renal donors, you can still have around 2% incidence of FMD, but this might not be hemodynamically significant. The vascular distribution is predominantly in the renal and the cerebral arteries, and more than 90% affected patients are females. The clinical presentation is classically young onset hypertension in females. Headache, pulsatile tinnitus, and transient ischemic attacks can happen due to the involvement of the cerebral arteries. The lesions are rarely progressive after 40 years. So whatever has to happen would have happened by 40 years, and they are rarely progressive after 40 years. And it is rare cause for advanced renal failure. It can though lead on to some renal dysfunction if it's bilateral. Fibromuscular dysplasia is predominantly medial fibroplasia, which occurs in 90%, and this gives a classic sting in beads appearance on a DSA. And it classically involves the middle to distal portion of the artery. The rarer forms include perimedial fibroplasia or intimal medial fibroplasia, which are focal and which can lead on to severe concentric stenosis, and therefore they are less amenable to revascularization. But fortunately, they are rare. The management is predominantly endovascular, with or without a stent, for a hemodynamically significant lesion. Again, only for a hemodynamically significant lesion. The PTRA results in disruption of the abnormal collagen bands, leading on to luminal dilatation and less turbulence of the fluid. The reduction in BP medicine is seen in more than 85% of the cases, while complete cure can be seen in around 1/3 of the cases. The predictors of response is low pre-intervention systolic blood pressure and younger age of treatment and shorter duration of hypertension. One thing which is important is since it involves young females, so if they want to pursue pregnancy and they have renal artery aneurysms, it's better to cure that prior to pregnancy because they can rupture during pregnancy or delivery, leading on to a catastrophe. So if you have a patient who even does not have a significant FMD hemodynamically, but has renal artery aneurysms, it's better to intervene prior to pregnancy. And in patients who have an aneurysm dilatation of more than 1.5 centimeters, it's better to subject them to a surgery rather than an endovascular procedure. Another disease which is quite common in our country is Takayasu's arthritis. It's basically a systemic large vessel chronic inflammatory disease affecting aorta and its branches. The prevalence is high in Oriental countries, particularly India, Japan, and Korea. It usually presents in the second or third decade. In the Indian phenotype, there is more involvement of the abdominal aorta, and therefore hypertension is much more common in our population as opposed to other communities. It usually affords a good long-term outcome with event-free survival of more than 80% for 5 years and the overall survival of around 80% and event-free survival of around 60% at 10 years. The management, though, is controversial. In early stages where there is inflammation, you can have a role of corticosteroids or other immunomodulatory drugs. Once you have a significant structural disease, then you can do endovascular intervention to relieve that. Now coming on to the most common cause, which is often the most discussed, and that is atherosclerotic renal artery stenosis. As we can see in this diagram, in this DSA, it is predominantly bilateral, usually ostial, is associated with a very diseased aorta, as we can see here, and is invariably associated with much poorer outcomes. If you look at a 3-year mortality, whether you treat this patient medically or with stents, you would still lose around a quarter of these patients. If you look at a 4-year mortality of the patients who have incidentally detected renal artery stenosis at cardiac catheterization, with or without intervention, you would lose around 1/3 of these patients in a 4-year follow-up. And again, if you look at a 5-year mortality, with revascularization, you are again looking at a very dismal outcome. And if you look at the overall survival as compared to other malignancies, it in fact fares much worse than most of the malignancies. It's much worse than NHL, it's much worse than colorectal cancer. So renal artery stenosis in fact has a much poorer outcome, 5-year survival, as compared to other malignancies as well. And the important reason for this poorer outcome is not only chronic kidney disease, but due to various other complications because of systemic atherosclerosis, including cardiovascular outcomes, peripheral vascular disease, and congestive heart failure. So this basically is a harbinger of much significant atherosclerosis all over the body. Medical management, how to manage these patients medically. We basically should have a prompt clinical attention to the cardiovascular risk factors. We should give high-dose statin therapy, effort to promote lifestyle modifications, including some cessation of smoking, and optimal control of blood pressure and metabolic syndrome if the patient are diabetic, a good diabetic control. Use of RAS inhibitors is actually central to medical management. It is more effective for BP control. It also improves long-term outcomes in cardiovascular remodeling as well as stroke. However, once you look at the cases with bilateral renal artery stenosis or critical stenosis of both the renal arteries or single functioning kidney, the role is a bit controversial. There is, as I said in the initial pathophysiology, there is a potential of acute kidney injury because of the loss of filtration pressure, which is maintained by the angiotensin II. However, if we look at the long-term data, including the randomized controlled trials, The data is pretty reassuring. These patients, however, if are started on RAS inhibitors, should be followed up very closely. So this is as far as the European Society of Cardiology guidelines regarding the use of, regarding the medical management of renal artery stenosis. ACE inhibitors and ARBs are recommended for treatment of hypertension associated with unilateral renal artery stenosis. You should control the blood pressure well by whichever antihypertensives you can use. The ACE inhibitors and ARBs may be considered for bilateral severe renal artery stenosis if they are tolerated well under a close monitoring. Now coming on to the much more controversial topic, which Dr. Mohan did allude to, and that is the endovascular interventions in patients with atherosclerotic renovascular hypertension. We have had 3 major randomized controlled trials. 2 of them were quite large, that is Astral and Coral. And there is another STAR trial which looked at patients with much more poorer renal function. It's important to note that the inclusion criteria, the interventions, the medical management, and the endpoints were different for all 3 trials. So the Coral trial, which is more contemporary, actually stressed a lot on the medical management, on a good control of blood pressure, significant use of ACE inhibitors and ARBs, irrespective of unilateral or bilateral renal artery stenosis in all the patients, giving of aspirin, giving of statins, good control of HbA1c, and cessation of smoking in all the patients. So Coral trial is more contemporary, has more contemporary medical management, and should be actually the best among all these trials. And all these 3 trials, though had a different endpoint, but they all had one thing in common. They all said that doing an intervention versus a good medical management made no difference on the outcomes, whether it was mortality or the renal outcomes. There is a subsequent meta-analysis which again was published after the Coral trial, which looked at around 2,000 patients in a randomized controlled trials. What they found was there was no change in systolic blood pressure, though the mean requirement of blood pressure medicines did go down. And if they looked at mortality, there was no difference between the intervention and the medical management group, and there was no difference in worsening of renal function in the 2. So therefore, medical management and endovascular management in an unselected patient with renal artery stenosis have similar outcomes, both renal as well as cardiovascular and mortality. Why is it so? There is a whole spectrum of renovascular phenotype. It starts with an incidental or an asymptomatic phase, leads on to renovascular hypertension, subsequently deconditioning of the heart, and then chronic kidney disease. So as we go down this spectrum, there is poorer response to intervention. So if you intervene early, once the patient only has renal artery stenosis and has no end organ damages, then maybe the intervention might be successful, but subsequently in later stages, it is not. So when to do a revascularization? If the patient has worsening kidney function due to ischemic renal disease, if the patient has uncontrolled hypertension in spite of good medical therapy, if the patient is intolerant to medical therapy, if the patient in spite of optimal medical therapy has recurrent hospitalizations because of pulmonary edema, or has unstable cardiac or renal trajectories. So these are the patients who are likely to benefit of renal revascularization as opposed to not. As physicians, we should not be doing any harm, and therefore it is important to know when not to revascularize. In patients who have advanced chronic kidney disease, who have been hypertensive for a long time, who have significant albuminuria, who have high resistive index on a Doppler study, who have marked decrease in renal artery size, who have nearly completely occluded vessel, and who have absent function on the split nucleus stent. So these are the patients in which you would do more harm by intervening than by not intervening. So you should not be attempting a revascularization. Another treatment modality is surgical revascularization. With the improvements in endovascular techniques and with stents, surgical technique is hardly done nowadays. It's basically limited to renal or aortic lesions which are not amenable to plastic, which, as Dr. Mohan would second, is now very rare nowadays. If you have total occlusion of the renal artery with abrupt loss of GFR, then maybe for salvaging such patients, you should do a surgical intervention. Nephrectomy is another option, but you only undertake this mutilating surgery if you have severe renovascular hypertension or atrophic kidneys. So this is what in fact is said in the European guidelines. So just one of my last slides as to how to approach a patient with renovascular stenosis. If you have a patient who has suggestion of renovascular hypertension and has a stable kidney and BP control, you just put this patient on RAS inhibitor, optical medical management, and have a close follow-up. If the patient has progressive disease, bilateral renal artery stenosis, and significant comorbidities, then you subject him to a Doppler or a CT or a MRI, whatever can be done best. If the patient has bilateral disease or a high-grade disease which is progressive, and if he is not getting optimized on a medical management, then these patients can be subjected to endovascular management. However, the bottom line is to have a stable kidney function and a good BP control. So just to summarize my talk, renovascular hypertension is a common, treatable, but often overlooked cause for hypertension and progressive chronic kidney disease. Unilateral and bilateral renal artery stenosis are different pathophysiologically and therefore have a different line of management. The diagnosis requires high index of clinical suspicion and appropriate use of diagnostic modalities, as I have highlighted. The management's goal is to look not only at control of blood pressure, but also at to slow the progression of chronic kidney disease. There is an important role of RAS inhibitors even in patients with bilateral renal artery stenosis. You can use them with stricter monitoring. The endovascular interventions are superior in patients who are younger and have a shorter duration of hypertension without end organ damage. Atherosclerotic renal artery stenosis is best managed medically with few indications for endovascular management. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahajan. That was a wonderful overview of the entire renovascular hypertension. Not only you were concise, but you were absolutely simple in explaining the whole concept of renovascular hypertension, the pathophysiology, the 2 kidney, 2 clamp, 1 kidney, 1 clamp model, 2 kidney, 1 clamp model very well. Also, I think the therapy, you have really gone very well with therapy. We have always been confused as far as therapy is concerned. I think you have simplified it very well. And we would have some questions, but let us put, we'll bring in our moderators also. But I would ask actually Dr. Govindan Unni to present his case, and then we'll have a combined discussion. 4 of you and me chipping in will talk about what our attendees have to ask you. Dr. Govindan Unni, please.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me straight, without wasting time, let me straight go to case 1. Now, this is a young lady, a 30-year-old woman with hypertension detected 6 months ago, 160 over 100 millimeters of mercury. And 3 weeks ago, she had rapidly progressive renal failure, creatinine rising from 0.9 to 5 milligram per deciliter. She had oliguria and her blood pressure also shot up to 210 to 120 millimeters of mercury. She also had dyspnea, orthopnea, fatigue, and arthralgia. There were no abdominal bruit, but there was a bruit over the right subclavian artery. And there was also a systolic murmur at the left upper sternal body. The upper and lower extremity pulses were normal, and there were no carotid bruits. An MRA without the use of gadolinium contrast of the abdomen demonstrated mild wall thickening of the abdominal aorta. There was no associated stenosis, no aneurysm formation, but there was total occlusion of both renal arteries. So this is a classical case of renovascular hypertension. which, as we already discussed, is the most prevalent, one of the most prevalent and important causes of secondary hypertension, and is potentially reversible also. Now, if you look at the causes of renal artery hypertension, you can see that atherosclerotic renovascular arterial stenosis is 9 times more common than the second common, which is renal fibromuscular dysplasia. And there are, of course, less common causes like renal trauma, arterial occlusion from a dissection or a thrombus, embolic occlusion of the renal artery, and inflammatory vascular disorders. Renal artery stenosis, by definition, is reduction in the renal arterial lumen by more than 50%. Atherosclerotic renal artery stenosis is seen more common when there are other atherosclerotic diseases, which this lady does not have. Like coronary artery disease, you get it up to 18%. And in peripheral artery disease, you got up to 25%. And in fibromuscular dysplasia, which is about 1 to 6%, you usually see that in a typically younger woman. Well, as already described, the 3 modes of treatment are medical therapy, angioplasty with or without stent, and surgical revascularization. So let us come back to case 1, the differential diagnosis. Now, based on her age and sex, and the presence of signs and symptoms of a systemic process, such as arthralgias and fatigue, the diagnosis should be focused on non-atherosclerotic systemic disease, which also has an inflammatory component also. And so the investigations should focus on inflammatory markers, should focus on autoimmune and immunological studies. So this lady had an anti-nuclear antibody result of 1 in 160, and her IgG was elevated. Her C-reactive protein was also elevated. Her ESR was normal, and a complete blood count showed thrombocytopenia and anemia. So naturally, with the diagnosis of a renal vascular hypertension, imaging studies were proceeded. And the imaging studies showed arterial wall thickening in the common carotid arteries. Multiple arteries were involved. There was increased FDG activity by PET, PET, PET scan in both common carotid arteries. There was complete occlusion of bilateral renal arteries. And after an initial balloon angioplasty, there were multiple arrows of narrowing, areas of narrowing and dilatation. So with all these imaging findings, immunological results, constitutional symptoms, age and sex, the diagnosis was an inflammatory arthritis, and most probably in the present surroundings, it is Takayusu's arthritis. So let me recapitulate. Case number 1 is a young lady, recently detected and recent worsening of hypertension, with recent worsening of renal function also.
Yes.
Having increased inflammatory markers and immunology markers, multiple vessels involved, including the renal artery, and the diagnosis will be an inflammatory disease like Takayusu's arthritis. So let us go to, so this is one extreme where you have a young lady with an inflammatory vasculitis producing renal vascular disease. Now let us look at another young lady. This is again a 28-year-old woman with a new onset, rapidly rising BP resistant to multiple medications. She is symptomatic with periodic headaches and fatigue, and her physical examination was unremarkable. No cardiomegaly, no murmur, no abdominal bruit. And so the differential diagnosis boils down to resistant hypertension in a young adult. So let us look at the secondary causes of hypertension that may contribute to treatment resistance. The 4 commonest causes of resistant hypertension, which you should investigate in all patients with resistant hypertension, are obstructive sleep apnea, renal parenchymal and renal vascular disease, and primary hyperaldosteronism. Then, of course, there are rare causes like pheochromocytoma, COAT, Cushing's, hypercalcemia, CNS tumors, acromegaly, carcinoid syndrome, etc. So let us investigate for the first 4 common causes. Her potassium was 2.9, which means she has hypokalemia, telling thereby that there is possibly some amount of hyperaldosteronism. And that was proved by the aldosterone level, which was elevated 93, the normal value being 0 to 30. So the next question is it primary hyperaldosteronism or is it secondary hyperaldosteronism? In primary aldosteronism, because of the increased levels of aldosterone, we expect the renin levels to be suppressed. And in this lady, we had high renin levels also, 19 nanogram per deciliter, the value being 0.6 to 4.3. So obviously, it is not a primary aldosteronism, it is a secondary hyperaldosteronism. The ratio of aldosterone to renin was 4.9, whereas it will be more than 30 if you are thinking of a primary hyperaldosteronism. So this rules out the diagnosis of primary hyperaldosteronism, and we boil down to secondary hyperaldosteronism. Well, renal artery stenosis, renal vascular hypertension being one of the commonest causes of secondary hyperaldosteronism, especially in such a young lady, the imaging studies were first done. The imaging study consisted of a renal ultrasound Doppler imaging, which did not show significant stenosis, only a questionable stenosis in the main right renal artery. But it showed an increased peak renal arterial systolic velocity of more than 180 centimeters per second, suggesting thereby that there was some obstruction to the right renal artery. In addition, it was found that the right kidney was smaller than the left kidney. A renal CT angiogram subsequently showed that there was a right renal artery stenosis with a beaded appearance of the distal right renal artery beginning 1.5 centimeter from the ostium, which is almost pathognomonic for fibromuscular dysplasia. So we have the case 2, which is another younger lady with resistant hypertension. Unlike the earlier lady, we don't have renal failure. Here, this is a resistant hypertension with secondary hyperaldosteronism, unilateral small kidney, and increased systolic peak velocity in the renal artery, suggesting thereby there is a stenosis of the distal renal artery, and the diagnosis obviously in this case will be a fibromuscular dysplasia. So now we have 2 young ladies with hypertension of 2 rarer causes of renal vascular disease. Now let us come to the elderly person, which is probably the more common cause of renovascular hypertension. So this is a 63-year-old man with progressive hypertension with an incidental renal artery stenosis. 3 years post-CABG, a year after the CABG, he had recurrent chest symptoms. He had a repeat coronary angiogram done, which showed that the bypass grafts were fine, except for a vein graft occlusion. But there was renal artery stenosis of greater than 70% luminal stenosis of both bilateral renal arteries. So this is classical incidental renal artery stenosis, where you can find that the patient is asymptomatic, hypertension is controlled, but he has what looks like a 70% luminal stenosis. His creatinine was normal at that time. Serum creatinine was only 1.3. His blood pressure was also perfect, 120/70. And he was on just one antihypertensive, atenolol. There was no other history of atherosclerotic event, CVA, or PVD, peripheral vascular disease. 3 months before the present referral, this man developed exertional chest discomfort after walking for 6 blocks. And the blood pressure shot up to between 180 and 200 systolic and 90 millimeters diastolic. His serum creatinine continued to be normal or reasonably normal of 1.4, and the renal angiogram showed bilateral renal artery lesions, which was similar to what happened 2 years ago. So you can see that the incidental renal artery stenosis remains similar of about 70%. Serum creatinine also remains similar, but the patient's blood pressure has shot up and he has become symptomatic in the form of increasing angina. So a percutaneous renal angioplasty with stent placement was done, and 5 weeks later, no angina. Exercise tolerance increased. Creatinine remained around 1.5, but he required more antihypertensives. He required atenolol, amlodipine, and indapamide. So clinic BP recordings came down to 132/72, and home BP recordings also averaged 123/67. So you can see 3 years ago, the incidental renal stenosis were diagnosed, but the BP was perfect. 6 months ago, again, the BP was fine. 3 months ago, the patient started developing angina and the BP started going up. And at the level of consultation, at the time of consultation, BP has shot up considerably. And then what looked like an incidental renal artery stenosis 3 years ago was stented, and the blood pressure came down. The angina also disappeared. But as you can see, from a single antihypertensive atenolol 3 years ago, now he is on 3 antihypertensives, atenolol, amlodipine, and indapamide. So these are the dilemmas facing a hypertension consultant, especially when dealing with an adult with atherosclerosis, developing renal artery stenosis, and hypertension. One, what is the importance of this incidental renal artery stenosis? Two, how will you manage hypertension that has become resistant and the renal artery stenosis remains the same? And three, when to undertake renal revascularization. As Dr. Sandeep, if you take it too early, if you had done the renal artery stenting 3 years earlier, nothing would have happened because his BP is normal. But if you had waited till he developed renal failure, again, there would not be any benefit. So when to undertake renal revascularization at the right time? These are the dilemmas facing a hypertension consult. So case 3, let me conclude, is an elderly patient with documented atherosclerosis, incidentally detected renal artery stenosis. With recent worsening of hypertension and angina, renal artery stenosis has not worsened subsequently, but opening of the artery resulted in BP reduction, resulted in angina, benefit in angina also, but required 3 antihypertensive drugs. So there is definitely some benefit in this patient also. So these 3 patients, if you look together, 2 younger women with hypertension, one with renal failure, and the third one with an atherosclerotic renovascular disease, you will find that these are the patients where you should look for renal artery stenosis. One, where the early onset, like the first 2 patients, or late onset, like the last patients. Worsening control of previously well-treated hypertension. All the 3 patients which I have presented have beautifully controlled blood pressure, though recently treated, and they became worse of late or recently worsening of hypertension. Of course, yet another thing, if you start RAS inhibitors, you will expect a creatinine rise of about 25 to 30%. But if you find that the serum creatinine is rising more than 25 to 30% after giving RAS, then one has to think about renal artery stenosis. Then other manifestations like a flash pulmonary edema, unexplained progressive renal failure, unilateral atrophic kidney, abdominal bruit, and unexplained hypokalemia. These are some other things which should also make you think of renal artery stenosis. As already said, the diagnosis of renal artery stenosis is by imaging studies. Screening investigation is a Doppler ultrasonography, even though there are problems like it may not be a good window, or maybe it is operator dependent. But you have, of course, CT angiography, which involves radiation, involves dye. We have MRA, which does not involve radiation or dye, but there is a gadolinium can produce systemic renal fibrosis. And the rest of the things which are already mentioned, which we now know are not useful as initial diagnostic tests. Renal angiography, obviously, is the gold standard for renal artery imaging. Individuals who have a very high absolute risk of renal artery stenosis or renovascular hypertension, those are the only patients who should produce directly to renal angiography. Rest of the patients should continue, we should be better off with imaging, which I have already done. I'm not going to, there are limitations, of course, degree of invasiveness, use of iodine contrast, etc. I'm not going into the pathophysiology or the treatment because Dr. Sandeep has already described all those things. So I think I'll probably stop here so that we have more time for discussion about not only these 3 cases, about the rest of the things also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Onni. I think those were 3 fantastic cases. I wish we had some pictures. It was more of actually text discussion, but nevertheless it was extremely interesting. And we now can have discussion. We can involve our moderators, Dr. Hegde as well as Dr. Panish Arora, and we would get going. But before we go any further, I will ask initially Dr. Umapati Hegde to give his comments and Panish to give his comments later on, and then we'll get to the questions. Dr. Hegde, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry. Good evening, sir. The cases were very fantastic, and the early age 2 patients who had fibromuscular and Takayasu also, it's common in India, which is a middle vascular disease, is more common, where you will get only aortic involvement with osteal lesions, and they come with hypertension and renal failure. And when you intervene these patients, it is very drastic, and they have a good improvement in the renal function. And even fibromuscular, I agree that when you have an incidental finding requiring only one drug, even there is any 60%, 70% lesion, I think we should leave them. And if there is an antihypertensive requirement is more than 2, or is serially increase in the Doppler finding showing that increasing the peak wave velocity, or the RI is going down, which shows that there is an ischemia, and then you intervene, then you have a good improvement. Or as Dr. Unni also said, if you treat these patients with an ACE inhibitor, sudden deterioration in the renal function, these are the patients which benefit much more. We also did a trial of around 220 patients we stented, which we published around 6 years back, which also showed a sudden deterioration, and the bilateral renal artery, they improved drastically as compared to incidental. Or all these patients were more than 70% involvement, and around 35% of patients had an improvement in the creatinine defined by more than 15% improvement, and around 40% of patients stabilized, at around 15 to 20% they deteriorated over a follow-up around 3 years. So if you do timely, as Dr. Sandeep said, it is rewarding. If you late, then already if there is any RI is going up because of the intrinsic disease, then you don't get a significant improvement.
Good. Panish, your views?
Yeah, so sir, I would tend to agree with you, because as a cardiologist, we used to, start after doing an angiogram, we used to take renal angio. Many times we would stent, de novo lesions in renal artery. Having become wiser after the 3 trials, the STAR, the Astral, and the Coral trial, the number has gone down tremendously. To select the right patient for intervention is very important. The primary thing is to control blood pressure very well, along with the risk factors. Those patients who are really in need, as has been highlighted by both the presenters, Dr. Mahajan as well as Dr. Unni, should be picked up, and only these patients should be subjected to interventions along with the good blood pressure control. So I would really like to congratulate both the presenters, because they have presented in a very simplified manner, so that some of the gray areas have been highlighted, and how to appropriately investigate and which patient to subject to intervention, and having stressed upon the right medical therapy is very important, and has been clearly brought out by the 2 presenters.
Yes, I do agree. And Pranish, the issues are actually much more complex in real practice, because every case is different. Let me just give an example. You have a unilateral renal artery stenosis. You think it is 90%, you have done an angiogram, but the patient may be well collateralized, and opening the artery may not benefit the patient. We have seen this thing quite often happening. Absolutely. Number 2, it is still a unilateral renal artery stenosis. However, because of long-standing hypertension, the other kidney is actually contracted. Now it is producing volume-dependent hypertension. So opening the renal artery stenosis doesn't help this patient. So there are multiple ways actually the problems are there, and these are unable to be solved. And the third issue, despite having a borderline renal artery stenosis, that too unilateral, we have seen quite often acute kidney injury occurring because of RAS blockade. And although it is quite uncommon, but when you encounter it, you suddenly realize what a dramatic thing happens to patients whom you started with this, and you were not even observing these people, and suddenly they come up with oliguria and rapidly rising creatinine. So there are issues in clinical practice which are not that easy to actually, understand. I think the renovascular hypertension is much more complex subject than we all have been thinking for quite some time. We would actually take some questions, and of course, the comments which I made, I think we'll take opinion of our experts on that. Now, the question one is from Dr. V.K. Reddy. It says many trials demonstrated that stenting or revascularization is not an effective therapy. So when to refer patient for revascularization? Now, we have already discussed that, but what we'll do is we'll start with Dr. Unni, go to Panish, and come back to actually our nephrologist friends.
Yeah, I think what we have to understand is that two things should be there. One is that blood pressure should be controlled, and two, renal function should not deteriorate. Yeah. So if your drug, whatever drug you are giving, RAS blockers, plus minus, calcium channel blocker, diuretic, beta blocker, whatever you want, if the blood pressure is controlled, if the renal function is not deteriorating, all you have to do is to continue the drugs and follow them up to make sure that these two things does not happen. On the other hand, your blood pressure is not controlled with drugs, or you find that when you start the drugs, the renal function is deteriorating. These are the situations where you have to interfere. Of course, another important place where you may have to interfere is patients coming with flash pulmonary edema. Otherwise, absolutely normal patient, one fine morning or rather one fine night, they come with an acute pulmonary edema. That is probably another indication for intervention. So I would say if the blood pressure is not controlled, if the renal function is deteriorating, go ahead and do a stenting.
So this gentleman may ask you a question. Let us say the guy has got an ultrasound done and one kidney is 1 centimeter smaller than the other kidney, and also Doppler scan says 70% stenosis. Would you consider this patient for revascularization?
If the BP is controlled, if the GFR is not coming down, there is no need for revascularization. As Dr. Sandeep said, the other kidney will be overactive because of the RAS stimulation, and because of the pressure in natriuresis, the other kidney will excrete the sodium and they excrete the fluid also. They will not go into fluid overload if you can control the blood pressure.
But what about ischemic atrophy which is taking place? Now that is a 1 centimeter size difference, or let's say 1.5 centimeter size difference.
In which case, slowly the GFR will start coming down and then you will have to interfere. So serial follow-up is required.
So, if the kidneys are well, say, you said 1.5 centimeter is what we take physiologically, because right kidney tends to be smaller than the left by 1.5 centimeters. So that's why the cutoff of 1.5 centimeters.
Yeah.
Intervening in a patient in which the blood pressure is well controlled and you are only intervening to preserve the renal function might not actually help. Because as I said, the stenosis would be more than 80%, 90%. You would have significant hypoxia on the ipsilateral kidney. If you intervene with your stents and revascularization process, you might actually aggravate the deterioration further rather than helping it by causing atheroembolic renal disease. So before going in, the indications should be very clear. If the renal functions are stable, as Dr. Unni said, and the blood pressures are stable, we are not worried. It's only once we see that the renal function of that ipsilateral kidney is going down, then the risk-benefit ratio would fall in favor of an intervention. So whenever we do a procedure, we look at the risk-benefit ratio. The risk-benefit ratio of an early intervention might not be there. It would only happen if you have a further deteriorating renal function. So you don't forget the patient. You follow up these patients with a serial ultrasounds, serial KFTs, proteinuria, and if required, the DTPA scans, and intervene the moment you find that the ipsilateral kidney function has started going down.
So the same corollary of the same question, Dr. Hegde, now that you have decided you would send this patient to interventionist, Pranish or person like me, and you say, go ahead and put a stent, what would you explain to the patient?
Basically, if you do a stent also, your blood pressure may not come back to the normal. If you intervene early, where the other kidney is not affected because of the hypertension. It's only around 5 to 10% of patients who become without any medication, the blood pressure will be controlled. But the only thing is the other complications are going to be less, especially if it is only one kidney, it's only angiotensin stress, angiotensin 2 will be very high, and all the renal angiotensin or RAS activation is affecting the all others will reduce. So not only to preserve the renal function, reduce the antihypertensive medication, but again, it won't go back to the zero. It will reduce, and a well control of blood pressure will be possible with a medication, which may not be possible even with increasing medications. So the other kidney also may get protected. Again, the RAS inhibition will benefit after the intervention, because the blood flow to the kidney is also good, and it will reduce the complication, the cardiac complications and others.
No, so Dr. Hegde, the question actually, which I was actually extending from the Dr. V.K. Reddy was, while explaining to the patient, you would have to give him certain idea how your blood pressure drugs will come down, how likely that nothing will happen, how likely that you will be cured.
Around 50 to 60% of the patients will benefit with improvement in the blood pressure, and requirement of antihypertensives will come down. Around 20 to 25% will remain the same, and there will be worsening of the renal function in 5-10% of the patients, which around 5% may be permanent, and 5% may reverse back after because of the contrast effect and other things.
So this issue of the contrast is one part, the other is cholesterol embolization. Because you manipulate aorta, you manipulate renal arteries, and these small debris, they just go in small vessels and actually produce small infarcts. Atheroembolism, and which is actually more of an irreversible thing. And this is something which we, of course, you wouldn't see that in fibromuscular dysplasia. You won't see that in aortoarthritis. So in these two conditions, you can't harm the patient. You may not do good. By and large, you wouldn't harm. But in a atherosclerotic renal artery stenosis, there is a potential for harm. And so we are becoming more conservative, more reticent about suggesting them, unless, of course, the clear-cut indication that Dr. Unni mentioned, actually. So I would agree with that, actually, what you have said. Pranish, any views on this revascularization?
Hello. So your voice got cut off. I couldn't follow the question.
No, Pranish, I was asking your views about renal revascularization.
Right, sir. So as you rightly put in, for patients who have fibromuscular dysplasia or Takayasu's arthritis, when indicated, it has been proven that ballooning and as a followed by bailout stenting has been shown to be beneficial in this subset of patients. For atherosclerotic renal disease, yes, we have to be very careful, because we have to pick the patient neither too early, because if you pick them too early, when their blood pressure is fully controlled, they have no complications and they have no heart failure and worsening of renal functions, then you are unlikely to benefit them. But once the kidney function comes down severely, then you are too late. So we have an antiplatelet strategy, bleeding strategies. We have to find that sweet spot, I would put it like that, when the benefit is likely to be much more than the risk accrued. And that we are in the middle, when the kidney is starting to become ischemic, the blood pressure is going up, there is a rising trend of creatinine attributable to the renal artery stenosis, and patient gets heart failure related to blood pressure. In that case, probably it will be definitely beneficial to go ahead with the revascularization.
So there is a little unrelated question, but it actually is the flavor of the day or the flavor of the month, flavor of the year. Will SGLT2 inhibitors work in renovascular hypertension? Dr. Unni, please. Will SGLT2 inhibitor work in renovascular hypertension?
I will like to keep my fingers crossed. There is no data so far. So I think we will have to wait. My guess will be as good as yours.
Yeah, the only thing I can say is that recently actually there was a an article in circulation about role of SGLT2 inhibitors in nocturnal non-dippers. And the reason is these renovascular hypertension are actually nocturnal non-dippers. So I'm just extending the whole thing. And in nocturnal non-dippers, they found almost a 10 millimeter decrease in systolic blood pressure with SGLT2 inhibitor. I don't know whether we can extend it to renovascular hypertension. I have no idea. I agree with you.
It is true that part of the actions of SGLT2 inhibitors are through the tubular-glomerular feedback, which stimulates, which suppresses the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So maybe it has some benefit.
And also would cause natriuresis, so some amount of volume-dependent hypertension would also go down. So it can benefit, so you never know, but it's definitely going to benefit in hypertension. So
you know, for Dr. Mahajan, for a person like you, it may be interesting to give somebody a thesis and see what happens. It may be extremely interesting. Some DNV thesis and some kind of data that would be very, very interesting to come out. You know. So the next question actually I think is something which any of us can try to answer. Simple. So what is the maximum dose of ARBs? Tell me versus olmesartan. Maximum dose as an anti-hypertensive drug. I think the reason the question has been asked, I can understand the reason, and I'll actually ask Dr. Hegde to actually take it.
Yeah.
Tell me, because there's a difference how nephrologists work and how cardiologists work.
So usually by increasing, we go up to around 80 milligram BID of telmisartan. And if you increase after that, sometimes there is no better control of blood pressure. It plateaus off, but there are some studies, even in losartan, they have shown that if you go above the level of that also, you may have anti-proteinuric may slightly better. But again, your blood pressure control, it will plateau off. So further increasing may not benefit. So over and above that, if you have a better blood pressure control, add on another agent which will have a better control rather than going further. And if the patient is developing a hyperkalemia or a renal function deterioration, then also we'll have to get back, lower the dosage.
So about olmesartan, would you go beyond 40 milligram a day?
We use 40 milligram or more than that, we have not used it.
Dr. Unni, you are very senior man. You should have an opinion on that.
So as a cardiologist, we don't go for supernormal doses. I think I will not go beyond 80 of telmisartan or 40 of olmesartan. And if you increase the dose further, the benefits may not be that much. The reduction in blood pressure may not be, it will not be 1 + 1 will not be 2. It may be 1.3 or 1.4 or something like that. Whereas hyperkalemia, worsening renal function, all will be much worse. So I would add a second drug rather than increasing, going to these supernormal doses.
Law and Wald's law.
Dr. Unni, actually as nephrologist, Dr. Hegde actually has brought up a point. We also are looking at times of antiproteinuric effect. So at times the supraphysiological doses, besides the reduction in blood pressure, does have an antiproteinuric effect, which is disproportionate to the BP control alone. And that's why for a nephrologist, writing 100 milligrams of losartan twice a day or 80 milligrams of telmisartan twice a day is still there, provided you don't have hyperkalemia. So the limiting factor for us at times becomes hyperkalemia. In fact, I am aware of a randomized controlled trial done in Calcutta, where they give telmisartan 80 BD versus telmisartan 80 once a day, and looking at the antiproteinuric effect in IgA nephropathy with the BP control. And not surprisingly, 80 BD of telmisartan did much better than 80 OD, both for proteinuria as well as BP control. So different people, different specialties, different intentions of giving a drug, especially the drugs which have a pleiotropic effect.
We use 80 milligram BD. Beyond that, we don't use it, even as an antiproteinuric also.
So this actually has been an area of some debate between nephrologists and cardiologists for a long time. Not only ARBs, but when it comes to amlodipine, there has been issues. I think we respect each other's views, and we will continue to have our differences. We go to the next question. It is by okay. We have the next question by Dr. Anil Patil. What is the maximum recommended dose? Okay, we have already taken that. Dr. Agarwal, do statin help in preventing progression of renovascular damage when renovascular hypertension has already occurred?
No, statins you give in an atherosclerotic renovascular disease because many patients with atherosclerotic renovascular disease don't die of renovascular disease, they die of MI or they die of stroke. So statins have a general beneficial effect. You don't give statin in a fibromuscular dysplasia or a Takayasu arthritis. So the basic atherosclerotic process, progression can be, at least acceleration can be reduced by giving statins.
Absolutely.
Sir, arterioembolic disease also shown to be less with statin. So that also will have an additional benefit.
Stabilization of the
Plaque.
Yeah, plaque
the Kodak trial, in
stabilization.
fact, has.
Definitely.
The trial, in fact, the baseline was statin.
I think a very valid point actually. Dr. Verma has this question to us. Hypertensive patient on amlodipine plus atenolol on routine investigation found to have microalbuminuria and blood pressure 144/86. How to proceed further? Remember, amlodipine plus atenolol. You know, it actually invites very strong views that atenolol business and the Europeans and especially the NICE guidelines, and of course atenolol having been dropped. But 144/86 certainly is not a controlled blood pressure by any stretch of imagination, especially when you have microalbuminuria. How would you proceed further? So we would we'll start with Dr. Mahajan and go to Dr. Hegde.
Okay. So my take would be, if a patient has microalbuminuria, better to shift him to ACE inhibitors. I have nothing against neither atenolol or amlodipine. We had UKPDS, which actually gave atenolol and found that, as opposed to any other antihypertensive, had the same venoprotective and cardiovascular mortality benefit, even up to 5 to 10 years. So UKPDS is a very valid study for atenolol. So, but I would actually cut down on one drug and put in a place for an ACE inhibitors. I'm still quite fond of using Ramipril. I don't replace ACE inhibitors unless the patient is intolerant with an ARB. If the patient has persistent dry cough, that's the only point. I would change from an ACE inhibitor to an ARB. I still believe that data of cardiovascular benefit is there much more with ACE inhibitors rather than ARBs. Most of the ARBs actually have started off with surrogate endpoints. We know olmesartan has found increased cardiovascular mortality as opposed to an ACE inhibitor. So I don't think so. ACE inhibitors and ARBs are replaceable. We give ARBs only if the patient is not tolerating an ACE inhibitor.
I would agree with you. And the reason, actually, the ESC 2018 as well as ACC AHA 2017 guidelines say when microalbuminuria is present, anti-RAS agent become a class 1A indication.
Sure.
Otherwise, they are actually a class 2B indication, which means you can actually use, there is no preference. There is a mild conflicting preference if there is no microalbuminuria. The moment microalbuminuria comes in picture, they jump up and become a class 1 indication. So I would agree with you. Dr. Hegde, your comment on that.
If the person is not having any proteinuria or microalbuminuria, any drug we can use first and foremost is blood pressure control. And calcium channel blockers are very good in controlling the blood pressure, and you can add a beta blocker. But this patient, you said, already have started having a microalbuminuria. So the RAS inhibitions, either it is an ACE inhibitor or ARB. Again, for a cardiac point of view, ACE inhibitors are much better. And if it's not tolerable, then I'll use an ARB and control it and titrate it to a higher dose. And then if the blood pressure has to be controlled, and then I'll recheck potassium and creatinine after around 5 to 7 days. Is there any increase in the creatinine, or it is within the limits of 15%, 20%? Then I'll continue and check for the potassium, whether it's not getting hyperkalemia. So then I'll continue, may increase the dosage if the BP is not controlled further.
Yeah, by and large, in the presence of nephropathy, we do agree anti-RAS agents are number one choice, along with amlodipine, because we have data actually from a accomplished trial. We had very impressive reduction in renal outcome, cardiovascular outcome, compared to using a diuretic, which was bendrofluoride in that study. But so we would agree. And the interesting part is that the International Hypertension Society, IHS, May 2020, have given that use only combinations in hypertension, not single drug. And the combination one is anti-RAS agent plus amlodipine. They are highly opinionated. And Dr. Neil Poulter has been, of course, currently the president of the International Hypertension Society, and from India, of course, Dr. Dorai Raj Prabhakaran was also on the writing committee. They said that if a combination has to be used, it has to be an anti-RAS plus amlodipine. So interesting, and I think I would agree with what Dr. Mahajan and you said. Doc, only you want to make a comment on that?
I think it is perfect. Number one, when there is an albuminuria, I also would prefer an ACE inhibitor. And only if there is cough, I'll change to an ARB. As Dr. Sandeep very rightly said, data is definitely more for ACEI. And secondly, 145 is definitely not acceptable in this patient. Yeah. It has to come down.
If the blood pressure comes down to less than 120/70, and the proteinuria also further reduces. So if the patient is young, tolerable, I think 120/70 might be a good target.
Dr. Arora, any difference of opinion?
No, sir, because even the the NICE guidelines, as they would also say that amlodipine and ACE inhibitors, they should be probably the first choice, and they are well tolerated in Indian patients also, which I have seen. For proteinuria, you may need to go with a higher dosage of ACE inhibitors. So for along with the BP management. And yes, hyperkalemia, if it's not there, then you can go up with the dosages. So ACE inhibitors are preferred over, ARBs, with the ARB MI paradox also there, which is a separate issue of discussion. So yes, ACE inhibitors would be my preferred choice also.
Yeah, I would also agree. Actually, we have data from Accomplish, we have data from ASK trial. We have a reasonably good amount of data. I would agree with that. And by the way, I was making a mistake. It's not International Hypertension Society, it's the International Society of Hypertension. Sometimes you have a slip of tongue. It is ISH and not IHS. I'm so sorry for that.
Yeah,
but those were the questions actually. Yeah. Dr. Mithilesh, the over to you. And Amit, of course.
Yeah, thank you. No. I was listening to the wonderful discussion you were having, sir, and I think it was very interesting. Sir, one question I had, about proteinuria with, of course, RAS inhibitors are definitely the gold standard. But now cilnidipine is also there, which reduces proteinuria. So, would you like to replace amlodipine with amlodipine to cilnidipine? Dr. Mahajan and Dr. Umapati, because I feel nephrologists use cilnidipine very, very, frequently in their patients.
Okay, so let me answer it first. The data with cilnidipine as far as proteinuria is concerned is very sketchy, very limited, and very small studies predominantly from Japan. There is hardly a large international trial which has looked at that particular aspect. Theoretically, yes, cilnidipine might have some benefit over amlodipine as far as proteinuria is concerned. But what happens clinically, nobody is certain. Number two, which is most important thing, is control of blood pressure is the number one priority. Cilnidipine is probably 1/4, if not less, as effective as amlodipine in control of blood pressure. We should not be compromising the control of blood pressure for a fashionable drug. I'm still an amlodipine guy and use cilnidipine very reluctantly if the patient is completely intolerant to amlodipine. Otherwise, cilnidipine is actually 1/4, not more than 1/4 as potent as amlodipine for BP control, in my experience.
as Sandeep said, I agree with it. First and foremost is blood pressure control. If you control the blood pressure, your proteinuria also will reduce. So yes, there is a mild benefit physiologically or theoretical benefit, but again, amlodipine is more potent as compared to cilidipine. So if it is a very mild, patient is only on ARB or an ACE inhibitor, you require a mild control you can add on. Otherwise, as a potency, if the blood pressure is not getting controlled, I'll go switch to amlodipine.
Actually, I would agree. Our disenchantment with these newer calcium channel blockers, I shouldn't call newer. Cilnidipine no longer newer, but of course, benidipine is, azidanidipine is, and we have been using. But I would completely agree with Dr. Mahajan. The outcome data is required. There is none. And efficacy is not as good as amlodipine. Now we got to accept it when it comes to brass tack. Amlodipine actually does much better job. I'm not worried too much about pedal edema. And I will tell you honestly, I take amlodipine. I don't take cilnidipine myself. So I just want to be honest with that. I get pedal edema, quite a bit of it, but I tolerate it.
Even the combination of amlodipine plus ARB, it reduces the edema also. So if you have a combination,
well, that is another point which the Italians in fact brought out. This Dr. Fogari brought out by plethysmography. It probably makes a small difference, but I think that paper was for publication only. I am not. Mechanistically, it makes a lot of difference. But patients to whom we have given, we haven't found too much of clinical difference. But that is another subject to discuss with controversy. And but Amit had a point because they have a cilnidipine. I do write cilnidipine, but I wouldn't say I write as much as amlodipine. I do write benidipine, but not as much. I think on L-type calcium channels, their efficacy is much less. They do work on N and T channels. Cilnidipine on N, and of course benidipine on L, N, and T. Cilnidipine also L, N, and T. But the L channels are the most important for vasodilatation. And unfortunately, cilnidipine and benidipine have a lesser effect on L-channel calcium channel, L-type calcium channels. This is how I think. And unfortunately, the vasculature is abundant with L channels and not so much with N and T channels. They're sparse, actually.
Right, sir. So any comment on young hypertensive with sympathetic overactivity, the role of cilnidipine in that case, sir?
If the blood pressure can be controlled, I am willing to use it. But the point again is we have many. First thing, let us agree, be honest that we need to know a lot about these young hypertensives. No trials have been done.
Right, sir.
Nobody has done trials to involve the young, uncomplicated hypertensive individuals who don't have diabetes, who don't have dyslipidemia, who don't have atherosclerosis, multiple risk factors. Whether newer beta blockers will do as well as the newer calcium channel blocker versus old calcium channel blockers. We need data. We have been talking about it now for 15 years roughly, and nobody has done any study. Nobody is doing anything. We should think of doing this thing. Actually, I strongly believe that we should try to collect data. The cilnidipine doesn't cause reflex tachycardia. That point I'm willing to accept. But as Dr. Mahajan said, it is a much less potent agent. As an antihypertensive, it is less potent. And the other thing is in combinations, you have only 10 milligram. You don't have 20 milligram. That is another drawback of combinations of cilnidipine. Whichever combination you talk of, that has only 10 milligram of cilnidipine.
Right, sir.
Yeah.
So I think, it brings us to the end of the program today, and it gives me an immense pleasure to offer a vote of thanks on behalf of Intas Zenith Division. And, this is the 8th program in the series, The Practice Pulse in Hypertension. And it's a rising popularity. Every program, we have more than 1,000 delegates, and today it's no exception. We had more than 1,000 registrations and live audience who watched today's proceedings, and I'm sure the interaction and the discussion which has happened has brought in newer learnings for all the delegates who have attended. So I must thank all the delegates on behalf of INTAS for attending today's webinar. And we would do another webinar on the second Saturday of next month, which will be 9th in series. And we would continue to do that, because it's a very simple medium to reach out to large number of audience. If you have to gather 1,000 delegates for a physical meeting, it would take humongous effort on our part. But this is a simple effort, and the learnings are immense. So I must thank Professor Dr. J.C. Mohan for being here, for being the guiding light in the whole program, and the kind of interaction and the discussion you bring in, it is phenomenal, sir. I salute you for that, sir. And I must thank Professor Sandeep Mahajan, who made a very simplified presentation on such a complex subject, and Dr. Govindan Unni for presenting lucidly the cases. The 3 cases that he presented were wonderful, and Dr. Umapati and Dr. Parnish for bringing in their expertise as moderators and panelists for the program. So on behalf of INTAS, I must thank you all. And let me tell you, as Dr. J.C. Mohan said, yes, we have a cilnidipine with the brand name Silni, and we do have Allmark, which is Olmesartan. In fact, we have a whole range of antihypertensives with us. So that is the reason why we continue to do this program on hypertension. We look forward to your valuable support for our antihypertensive product basket. So once again, thank you very much from our side, INTAS, and we signing off tonight. And good night to all of you. Thank you very much.